Neuroscientist David Eagleman once said, "There are three deaths. The first is when the body ceases to function. The second is when the body is consigned to the grave. The third is that moment, sometime in the future, when your name is spoken for the last time." For an artist, one of the primary motivators behind the act of creation is the staving off of this third death. For composers like Sergei Prokofiev and William Bolcom, the most personal and direct expression of their artistic achievement will still be available at the touch of a button thanks to modern recording technology which allowed them to record their own compositions while they were still alive. They can rest easily knowing that their contribution to society remains safely preserved for all to hear. For other composers, however, the responsibility of performing their music lies entirely with modern instrumentalists, leaving the work of interpretation up to the competency of the composer's notation and the musician's imagination. In the era of instant streaming and home recording technology, the question now becomes, what responsibility does the performer have to the composer's original intention? To start out, there's a variety of criteria that we can look at when determining the value of a musical interpretation. The first and most obvious of these is accuracy. If you're not playing the notes as they appear on the page, even if it's in the name of interpretation, it's generally understood that your performance is worth less than an accurate one. This principle extends to features like articulation and dynamics. The implementation and intensity of these are up to the research and imaginative capacity of the player, but to ignore them altogether is tantamount to inaccuracy. Second criterion, and the one we'll be speaking about at length, is instrumentation. Composers almost always write their music with a certain idea of what the instrumentation should be. In the case of orchestral compositions, the composer designates parts for each instrument, and then the director or conductor can take liberties in terms of balance, color, and doubling. For solo compositions, much consideration is given to the range, tenor, and specific gifts of the instrument in question. Even then, however, a particularly famous piece of music will often be transcribed, transposed, and arranged for many different solo instruments depending upon market demands. Rachmaninoff's transcriptions of Bach's violin partitas are considered among the finest works of either composer, despite the fact that Bach's intention when writing a violin partita certainly wasn't to have it performed as a piano solo instead. Beginning in the 20th century, new focus has been placed on. Many orchestras often perform Baroque and Renaissance-era works using replica instruments from the time of composition, and many recordings are even produced in spaces which elicit the types of atmospheres where ancient music would have been performed. Music produced with the intention of matching the conditions of its original performances has gained the moniker Historically Informed Performance, or HIP for short. One of the earliest advocates for HIP was keyboardist and musicologist Wanda Landowska. An eminent Polish keyboardist, Landowska already had some experience transforming and recontextualizing art, as her mother wrote the first Polish translation of the quintessentially American novel Tom Sawyer. Starting in her mid-30s, Landowska found a love for antique harpsichords. By her time, music and instrument making had evolved side by side, and the piano was now the keyboard instrument of choice regardless of the piece or composer. This passion for antique instruments eventually led her to Paris, where she commissioned top piano maker Pleyel to build a series of harpsichords, and though their construction was unconventional and possibly even a bit crude, they offered the public an opportunity to hear Bach's music as Bach heard it. One of the most infamous figures of Bach performance is Canadian pianist Glenn Gould. Known for his bold choices in tempo and articulation, Gould's interpretations of Bach's work are both celebrated and criticized for their dynamic and often playful approach to these artistic elements. Speaking on Gould's technique, harpsichordist Scott Ross has this to say.
Mais bien entendu, de même que je suis un adulte doué.
In Ross's eyes, even though Gould is playing all the right notes and is interpreting the piece in a measured and artful way, his interpretation strays from Bach's original intention. and because of this, it insults Bach's creation and is worth less artistically. It's difficult to compare Landowska's recordings to Glenn Gould's because Landowska only ever recorded on the harpsichord, and Gould only ever recorded on the piano. Still, we can note a few glaring differences. Wanda Landowska plays with much more evenly measured lines and consistent tempi, and makes a special point to follow all written ornamentation to the letter. Thanks to the attributes of the harpsichord, her passages are also much less sharply articulated than Gould's. On the subject of harpsichord technique, many scholars have advocated that the harpsichordist attempt to play with as smooth and connected a touch as possible. Because the plucked strings of the harpsichord give the performer such little control over the length of an attack, the transition from one note to the next must be carefully controlled in order to avoid any dead space. In this way, her choice of instrument greatly factors into the idea of the correct interpretation of Bach's music. Once, after being criticized by one of her contemporaries, Landowska cut back, saying,
"You play Bach your way, I'll play Bach his way."
Obviously, she had put a great deal of care into producing the most authentic interpretation of Bach's music. Still, even Landowska isn't without her retractors. A letter to the editor of a prominent music journal in 1965 shows us that some weren't happy with Landowska's role as a leading Bach interpreter of the time.
She always played the music as written, with the result that a series of fast notes did not sound like bundles of them, but like a sewing machine. Thanks to her wide influence, this blight can be heard in her pupils to this day.
Back and forth, disagreements on the proper interpretation of Bach's music will probably never be definitively settled. But more important than Wanda Landowska's concrete contributions to Baroque technique is the philosophy of authenticity and intent that she ushered in at the beginning of the 20th century. Because of the importance she placed on research and instrumentation, keyboardists can approach the music safe with the knowledge that they are preserving the memory of the great composers for generations to come.